Hello, and welcome to this latest devotional podcast from Holy Trinity Leicester. And we're in the last chapter of Nehemiah. We're in the home straight. And as this book just begins to close, as over these next few days we land the plane, we're left, I think, longing for something better. We're left longing for someone better. And that's what I'm thinking about today, how we are left longing and what we long for. I'm going to read the passage out that I want us to think about this morning. It's verses 10 through to 14, a really short section. This is Nehemiah speaking, and he says this: I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given to them, and that all the Levites and musicians responsible for service had gone back to their own fields. So I rebuked the officials and asked them, why is the house of God neglected? Then I called them together and stationed them at their posts. And all Judah brought the tithes of grain, new wine, and olive oil into the storerooms. I put Shelmiah, the priest, Zadok the scribe, and a Levite named Pedaiah in charge of the storerooms, and made Hanan, son of Zuccah, the son of Mattaniah, their assistant, because they were considered trustworthy. They were made responsible for distributing the supplies to their fellow Levites. Remember me for this, my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. You'll know that the context of this chapter is that Nehemiah has returned back to Jerusalem, having had to go and probably give a report to the king of Babylon as to how it's all going in the rebuilding effort. And when he returns, he finds that in his absence, all kinds of things have started to sprout up in his absence that shouldn't have been there. We heard yesterday how Tobiah, the one who had opposed rebuilding, had been given a room in the temple courts, a sacrosanct place that no one should be allowed to live, let alone an enemy of the people of God. And in our passage today, we find that the Levites, who kept the temple running, who were supposed to be paid through the tithes of the people, hadn't been paid. So they'd been forced to abandon ship, to go back to the fields, to farming rather than serving at the temple to earn a living. And we find later in this chapter other things have sprung up, all these things that Nehemiah has to just pull up his socks, has to get his hands dirty and deal with, sometimes in a really tough way. The picture that's really helpful is almost like he's having to do some weeding. If you have a garden and you've ever cleared a bed of soil and planted flowers in it, you'll know that to begin with it looks great, it's just these pristine flowers and the pure soil around them. But then if you just go away for even a couple of days sometimes and come back, you find that these weeds have just started to grow up again. And if you leave it for too long, you get brambles, and thick, deep-rooted brambles that we've got in our garden right now that are really hard to pull up. And this is what's gone on in Nehemiah's absence, that sin in the community has sprouted these awful things that he's having to just put on the gardening gloves and really pull up and deal with. And it's really tough and really frustrating. And that's why he says at the end of that passage, remember me, God. Remember just how tough this was. Lord, give me strength. Help me to look towards the reward as I do this. Almost to change the picture slightly, I think Nehemiah in this chapter is having to play whack-a-mole. Just that fairground game where you're constantly having to hit things just as they appear. And as soon as you hit one thing, you realise another thing's popped up. And as soon as you hit that, another thing pops up. Really tiring and frustrating for him. And many of you will know that the government currently has a whack-a-mole strategy to deal with coronavirus. Perhaps the best strategy we can have given the circumstances. But you know just how frustrating that feels, especially when you feel like the mole that's being whacked. Problem with whack-a-mole, problem with weeding so often is that it's just never ceasing. And things keep reappearing at the place you've just dealt with them. And that's the feeling here in Nehemiah. He must have been utterly frustrated. And he must have come to the end of himself time and time again as he just sought to re-establish a community that loved God, that was pure, that wouldn't suffer exile again, but would get things right a second time. And I think as we read the end of Nehemiah, we're left longing for something better. I'm sure Nehemiah was left longing for something better. And we're left longing, I think, for specifically someone better. See, Nehemiah, as great a man as he was just a man. He couldn't be constantly present to deal with these things. In fact, one day he'd die, and then what would happen? And the way that he had to deal with these things could only ever be external. He couldn't deal with the deep-rooted sin, the roots of these things that gave rise to the weeds and caused these things to pop up. He couldn't deal with that. It's the last part of the story, the Old Testament narrative, interestingly. And we're left longing, I think, for the one who would appear in the next testament in the Bible, the one who breaks into the scene at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, and changes everything. We're left longing, I think, for Jesus. I think we're left longing for Jesus because he's the one that can really deal with the deep-rooted sin from the inside out, transforming us. At the work of the cross, he destroys sin at its very root, so that when he deals with sin through the work of his Spirit inside of us, it's dealt with and it doesn't reappear. We can say goodbye to those things because he's done the finished work. And we're left longing for Jesus because he's the one who does live forever, that he'll constantly be present to us, all the life long, wherever we are, to deal with the things as they arise that torment us, that frustrate us, that cause guilt within us, that we wish weren't there. And for us, we have this Jesus, the one who the Apostle Peter says the angels long to see and the prophets search to find. We have this Jesus who's the greater, the better one than Nehemiah, greater and better than any of the Old Testament figures, the one who we're left longing for, who we've met. And I think for us that should create two responses. Firstly, thanksgiving and joy. We have this Jesus in our lives, that we know him. We know someone who's more powerful than the most powerful person, a better leader than the greatest leader, a more effective person to bring transformation than the greatest of transforming people previously, reformers and renewers of community. And we have this Jesus who loves us and who longs to change us from the inside out, that we're not left just playing whack-a-mole, we're not just left frustrated with weeding time and time again. And I think the second response is that we're to make the most of Jesus, that actually he promises that as we come to him honestly about the things that are in our life, he deals with them. He longs to deal with them. He longs to transform us, to make us more like the person and the people we're meant to be, to make us more like him, in fact, who's completely free in his freedom to glorify God and to represent him to the watching world. And I think he's asking us to actually realise this, that actually we're to stop trying to deal with stuff ourselves. We, like Nehemiah, could be tempted to do that in our own lives, and we don't get very far. It's just an unending battle. And to actually come to him, he deals with things in a finished and final way. And for you, I wonder why it is that you might be dealing with, that you feel frustrated with, about yourself, or perhaps even in your family and in your community. That constantly, you're just time and time again having to deal with. You go away and it comes back again. I wonder if you brought that to Jesus. I wonder if it's time to bring it to Jesus for the first time. I wonder if it's time to bring it to Jesus again and ask him by the power of his Spirit, by his word, to transform it, to deal with it as only he can. Don't miss the opportunity, the grace that we've received through knowing Jesus. We're blessed people. Let's make the most of it. Amen.